All right. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. I am honored to be speaking from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Our guest today is Ryan Chan, coordinator for the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, as well as a social advocate and soon-to-be graduate from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our honor. It's our honor. So, Ryan, in that brief intro I gave about you, there was one key word there, which was a social advocate. So, how does one become a social advocate? How did you get to that point in life where you decided, I need to start to change things?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know that everyone has their own path. My own actually, you know, I think a lot of people think that you're like born into this, and I don't think that's necessarily true. And I really want to encourage everyone to consider this kind of work. I grew up in Hong Kong, and the kind of elephant in the room there is that racism is very much internalized. It's just kind of part of the culture. Nobody really questions white supremacy, and there's kind of like a hierarchy of races, and it's just something that people might say like publicly, oh yeah, it's a problem, but then really just like let it continue. So I grew up in that kind of society where to some extent it was just kind of like you kind of accepted that like there was white people were like better, despite the fact that Asian people were the majority in Hong Kong. So at the back of my mind, I always thought that that was kind of problematic, but nobody was going to do anything about it. Nobody felt the need to do anything about it. And so it was interesting that when I came to Canada, I still had some of these like notions that, maybe I shouldn't be too Asian. I was like concerned about how, people would perceive me if I was like, hanging out with like Asian people, making Asian friends, being too in touch with my own culture. That kind of changed for me like a couple years later. When I was seeing that, a lot of people with Asian heritage are actually quite proud of it. They were proud to be, I'm in law school now, so I'm, I saw a lot of lawyers who, prominent lawyers who were like proud of their heritage, right? That they were, proudly Asian. And so, that kind of like got me started. And so, like I kind of went on that journey to try to reclaim that part of my heritage, to be, show off who I was. And so I started, looking for, these kinds of social advocacy work. Unfortunately, it was actually very difficult to find it because, unfortunately, pre-COVID, and the major uptick in anti-Asian racism, there wasn't a lot of or very recognized anti-Asian work. Anti-Asian racism work, because it was kind of not accepted that anti-Asian racism was real. So basically, I kind of just leapt at every opportunity that I could get, and eventually I stumbled upon the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers, and now the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, and like I got very involved. I wanted to do as much as I could for my community, and I guess to some extent I was just kind of in position when, when all of this madness kind of started with COVID, and, I finally got the opportunity, once there was a little public recognition of the issues, we got the opportunity to really do some good work in our community.
That's awesome. And being in the right place at the right time with the right attitude makes all the difference. One thing you said about your experience in transitioning from Hong Kong and the mindset there to Canada, where you perhaps were, presented with maybe it wasn't, that previous mindset wasn't exactly true, or there was maybe something that needed to be looked at. I've had a similar experience echoed in my own upbringing. So I grew up in the Middle East. My parents were expats there, and they had that social hierarchy as well. So people from the UK, from Australia, from America, from Canada were at the top. Then the local people, then the other related Arabs, then foreigners from different parts of the world, and then it keeps going down and down and down. And each strata of society was treated very differently. And I will say that's probably one of the first instances in my life where I saw blatant racism and discrimination in the treatment of people, not just an idea. So as you came to Canada and you were confronted with maybe a different way of thinking, maybe things that aren't perfect, but still some good stuff here. Did you experience any kind of awakening moment when you were like, actually, we do face racism. I face racism. Have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, so I certainly faced racism, and I was like aware of racism, I think, throughout my life. I think the only real difference was that I just thought it was okay, or it was just kind of like one of those things in the background. I know it's bad, but we don't really talk about it, or like, what's the point of trying to change it? It's just the way things are. So, that's kind of how I thought about it. It was like one of those big problems that maybe it's someone else's job to fix, or maybe it's just unfixable, which, I now think is absolutely ridiculous. But for me, it really was seeing other leaders in the field. I always thought that this kind of like social advocacy work was just this kind of, something way off in the distance, nothing to do with me, nothing I can really contribute to. But when I was seeing that, like, everyone was kind of playing, even like a little role, just, on social media, like advocating a little bit for it, talking about it. And it really changed when I saw like really like leaders of, the legal industry, people that I like look up to, like their ability to be comfortable with their race and to say like, what's going on is not okay. We need to change. And we need, you, the next generation, to do something about it. I feel like that was really like a turning point for me. That was kind of shocking that these people could be successful and still say that, racism is a problem, and they're actively trying to change, and they're actively showing that they're Asian. I always thought it was something that I had to hide, and something that, maybe I do like in the shadows. But to see that people were like actively out there and putting themselves, forward, I think that really made a difference for me.
Well, I will say that that is reflected in a lot of the conversations we have with community leaders. We had a recent interview with MLA Jenny Sims, and she was talking about how respect for our heritage, how learning about our heritage, our culture, our background, whether you're Asian, Black, white, Muslim, Sikh, whether you're from anywhere in the world, how important it is, because those are the pieces of the Canadian cultural mosaic, right? And those pieces, if you don't appreciate them, if you don't understand them, and you don't bring them together, there's no mosaic. So having that experience, as you said, to see role models, to see actual people living that life where they are incredibly successful, but also connected with their background, their heritage, and proud of it. Proud of it, not to the detriment of others, but proud of it to the benefit of their own communities and of everyone. I will say that having those experiences in all communities is vital. And part of the work that you're doing now with the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice is to help provide youth with those leadership positions, with those leadership role models. So maybe why don't you talk to us a little bit about the educational aspect of what you're doing or what the organization is doing?
Right. So we're running a couple educational campaigns. So one of them is tackling racism in grade 4 and above. So, getting in there like pretty much as early as we think is like appropriate, where children can start to understand conceptions of race and racism. And so the idea is that children face like a lot of racism. But the problem is they kind of pass it off as like jokes, or their friends like messing around, because the reality is like so much more painful, right? So children, they kind of internalize this kind of racism by thinking like, oh, it's just for fun. It's just, they don't mean it. There's just jokes. But that's very, very problematic, because that kind of mentality stays with you as you grow up. So one of the things that we're working on is we're developing educational tools that kind of allow parents and teachers to like open up the conversations about race and racism, to say like, this kind of thing is not okay. You have to be aware of, who you are, what people can and should not say to you. And so we're working with, some very generous sponsors like Aldo, the Ministry of Education, and we're trying to bring those tools, to the wider population, to schools, to the public, and, getting that in right at the outset. And like another thing is, training the, people like me, I suppose, the next generation of social advocates. So that is something I mentioned that we're partnering with Aldo to do, where we're basically training law students, people like myself, to take on the fight, basically. I think, one of the issues is that racism is systemic, and everybody hears that word, but like, what does it really mean? Like, is it like, is it built in, or like, is there like a racism bureau? Like, it's not like that. The problem is that all of the structures that we have, police, laws, like housing, all of these things, they were built on racist attitudes. And so, I mentioned law as one of the big ones. And, to be able to empower a new generation of advocates, we have the ability to change those things. We have the ability to, lobby the government to make those changes, to educate people on like what needs to be changed. And so we've identified that as like an important thing that we need to go after. And that's why we're focusing on education next.
And for dealing with these major issues, it's not just something that the Chinese Canadian National Council has just started doing. So it's been around for a while to help to address racism, particularly against the Asian community and the Chinese community, which is a fundamental part of the Canadian mosaic. So maybe for our viewers, why don't you explain a bit of the background of the organization? Maybe talk to us a little bit about the values, the vision, the mission, and then we can look into how the programs are being run to actually change things.
Mm-hmm. So CCNC started 40 years ago, way before my time, in response to the anti-W5, in response to the W5 broadcast. So it was called the anti-W5 campaign, and it was in response to a documentary aired by CTV where they were trying to explain that Canadian students were losing university positions to Chinese foreign nationals. And so they had a whole documentary about how they went around campus and, oh, everyone's Chinese was what they were trying to portray. When in reality, all the people that they showed were perhaps ethnically Chinese, but the majority of them were permanent residents and citizens. So, this kind of like racist overtone was kind of inherent, all the way 40 years ago, like this idea of like all these foreigners like taking up resources, taking opportunities away from Canadian citizens. And so, our organization was founded there to combat that. In our 40-year history, perhaps one of the more, famous moments is when our organization managed to get Stephen Harper to apologize for the Chinese head tax and to get reparations for that. So, we have done a lot of work, and, more recently, what you may have heard is our response to the COVID pandemic. But what you may not know is, way back in 2003 for SARS, we were saying that racist attitudes would happen. People would blame Chinese people on SARS, and that's what happened. And then so when COVID's around the corner, we're saying, we're looking at the same kind of thing. We're talking about something that has already happened where Chinese people are blamed for a pandemic, and nobody was listening. So, which is crazy because it's exactly the same thing, right?
So like to hear that, like we know COVID is probably what really poured fuel on this fire. In Vancouver, where I'm speaking from, there was a 714% increase in hate crime against Asian people. So it's not just insults or online rhetoric, or it's actual crimes with a hate component that were reported. 714% in one city. And UBC, the University of British Columbia, which is in many cases a bastion of peace and thinking and liberal mindset, women were attacked. Asian women were attacked there just because of their race, and we see this across the country, that a lot of what was under the skin, if you want to call it that, of this feeling of hatred towards people of Chinese or of Asian descent just coming to the forefront because of COVID. It is shocking to see for many people to understand that this is real. This is really happening. Our cousins in the Southern United States are experiencing widespread anti-Asian hate and attacks. And what I would like to maybe see from your perspective, firstly, as a person, as an Asian person, like how does that make you feel when you like to see like just innocent grandfathers being pushed into like traffic for no reason? Like it's horrific.
Yeah, like you said, absolutely horrific. And you know, I've mentioned this before because it like racism is like complicated. People think it's like, oh, it's a tax, and if you're not attacked, you're fine. But it's so much more complicated than that. Yes, there is the immediate fear, right? You worry if like you're going to be the next person to be like yelled at on the street, to be spat on. I myself have been told to go back to China on several occasions. Just going to get groceries, right? So there's always that immediate fear of like, some kind of physical assault or like a backlash. Do I say something? Do I not say something? But you have to understand that, especially, in the current climate where these attacks are so frequent, our own reporting tools indicate that something like 1,100 cases, but, grossly underreported number. That's just like people who happen to find our website and, covidracism.ca and submit a report there. But, when these attacks are sustained, it starts to create like a fear within the community, right? You start getting texts from your friends and family that are like, maybe don't go out today. Be really, really careful when you're going to the grocery store, which is crazy to me that we can be in Canada in, 2021. And I have to be like, looking around the corner and like being aware of my surroundings. I think that's pretty insane. So there's always that immediate fear, but, going even deeper than that, right? The idea that, on a whim, like just people, it feels like society just turns on you, right? Canada's first response to COVID was racism, right? It was this idea that, it was Chinese people, like, that's not a racist thing to say. It happened to start in Wuhan and they brought it here, right? But it's this idea that like, on a whim, people will turn against you. People will blame you for all these problems. And, it makes you think like, am I just a perpetual foreigner, right? Am I always going to be seen as different? Am I always just like, not Canadian or something, And so, yeah, that really has a huge impact on your self-esteem, right?
And what you're talking about, I've heard it from many communities in the Muslim community, for example, women who wear the hijab, right? So they are visible, right? They're visibly different. In Edmonton recently, 5 women who were Black and Muslim were assaulted, attacked, on the streets in broad daylight. And it's this kind of feeling that I'm always going to be a target, right? That because I'm different, because I'm visibly different, just because of that I have to pay more attention to my surroundings. I have to be more cautious. And that mindset, that kind of, it creates an environment of fear and creates an environment where you're not able to fully live your rights as a Canadian, as a citizen, as a human being. And the anti-racist organizations such as yours, such as Islam Unravelled, which we have a bit shared DNA because Islam Unravelled also started to deal with media misconceptions, right? What is the misconceptions of Muslims going on and who's perpetrating that? So it's very interesting because racism, it targets everyone, right? It's not just towards one people and then we say, oh, it's that person's problem. It's a communal problem. Like we cannot allow it towards anybody, whether it's our Black colleagues, our Asian friends, our First Nations and Indigenous people. They face a lot of racism. One comment I had was a First Nations person was told to go back to China because of this, and the racist mindset. My colleague Tarek said it's a mental illness. It's a mental illness when someone becomes that racist for no reason. But the work being done to help address these, to help support people, going through the programs that you're offering, one interesting one that I came across was face race. So hashtag face race. Maybe would you like to tell our audience a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So face race campaign is kind of it's like a digital artifact. It's kind of a collection of stories, media incidents, experiences of people in the pandemic, right? Like as our community, right? And so the idea is that it's supposed to be both a reminder and a call to action for members of our community and to allies that, this is how quickly things go wrong, how quickly, people will turn on you, and how pressing the issue of racism is. It's always kind of bubbling under the surface. And, I mentioned briefly that this is not a new experience, right? We literally had SARS as kind of an example of like how this kind of thing happens. It's almost identical, right? And how quickly people forget, right? And how quickly people, in that time frame, decide that like racism is not real. So the idea of Face Race is that, it tells these stories, it keeps a collection of them. It's a reminder to our community of the experiences that we had of racism during the pandemic. And so, hopefully this inspires members of our community to, embody principles of anti-racism, to try to, talk about race, talk about their own lived experiences, and, serve as a reminder that, going forward, we can't just like, even when the pandemic is over, we don't just, go back and, when anti-Asian racism is no longer front page news, we don't go back and say like, oh yeah, that was then and now we're here, so everything's okay. No, we need a reminder to everyone. And, we do hope that, people use that hashtag, right? Like Face Race, like acknowledge that racism is a thing, acknowledge your own race, right? And acknowledge like allies and other communities, and, because we're in this all together.
And that because now what we're talking about hashtags, right? So now this transitions into a major topic, which is social media. Social media and the online world. Now, both what that is doing positively, but also what that is doing to fuel racism, both in Canada, in the United States, and around the world. So maybe let's start by talking about how has anti-Asian hatred and racist comments increased during COVID? What have you seen as the trends, the common trends online?
Right. So we actually have some really good research on this topic, as a starting point at the very least. So with collaboration from one of our partners, Professor Ahmed at the University of Toronto, he was actually able to track racist tweets on Twitter over like a month period. And we saw thousands and thousands of tweets directed towards Chinese people and, anti-Asian, anti-Chinese specifically racism. And there was huge spikes every time Donald Trump would tweet. So every time, it was like Kung flu and, Wuhan, like China virus, that kind of thing. And so social media has, there's this misconception, I think, that social media amplifies racist beliefs because it's a giant megaphone, which is partly true. But it's not as simple as that, right? Social media makes use of algorithmic learning because it wants you to stay on its platform for as long as possible. The longer you stay, the more ads they play you, the more money they make. And so essentially, like, for example, your Facebook timeline, right? Everybody may realize this, that your posts, they're not chronological, but like, what is the actual order? The actual order is what Facebook thinks is most likely to engage you. And it doesn't have to be a positive engagement. It may trigger you, right? It may be a cause that you support, but it may be a cause that makes you angry. And so hateful material, racist posts, that kind of thing, those are provocative. It makes, the small subset of people or the people who are, on the borderline, they may be interested in a similar perspective. But for people on the other side, they may think this is like hugely offensive and they want to comment to have it removed. But that kind of content drives up interactions. And so Facebook and these other social media companies, they actually like that kind of content because it makes them more money. And so their algorithms, intentionally or not, are pushing that kind of content. And so you find that content to be more pervasive and more shown on social media.
On social media, because it's a business, right? So it increases
Right.
viewership, as you were saying, is increasing ads. And with the removal of Donald Trump from Twitter, have you seen maybe any evidence increase to illustrate that maybe it's reduced a little bit to the amount of anti-Asian, the daily hatred being produced? So is there a way to perhaps correlate these large public figures pushing this narrative of disunity?
So unfortunately, we don't have the budget currently to run more updated research, but we're hoping that that comes in at some point soon. But all I can say is there is a clear correlation that, at least in the past, when every time Donald Trump tweets, there would be a huge uptick in anti-Chinese posts. So, the research is already there, and I'd love to provide more, but there isn't a ton. Financially, it can be kind of difficult to run research like this.
Of course. And many of our viewers might not be aware, but actually a lot of the producers of online hate per capita, Canada is actually more than the United States. So in your experience, have you seen any difference between what is going on in the United States online and perhaps the Canadian flavor of that as it relates to anti-Asian rhetoric?
Yeah, so the big example that I have, and my organization, felt this firsthand, was the Brian Adams tweet. So to the viewers who may not have heard about this, I have the actual quote. Basically, Brian Adams tweeted out. Let me just get that.
Brian Adams, the singer?
Yes, the singer. So he tweeted out, thanks to some effing bat eating, wet market animal selling, virus making greedy bastards, the world is on hold. So, to us at least, you could debate this, but to us at least, that was a blatantly racist tweet. It references all the fake news, all the kind of, bat soup. I'm sorry.
Stereotypes and
stereotypes. Yeah. And it's like bat soup and, Chinese bioweapons, the whole shebang, right? So to us, that was like blatantly racist. And at the very least, it was on the borderline such that it inspired a lot of racist responses. People like the problem is when he was called out on it, Brian Adams said like, oh, it was about promoting veganism. What virus making has to do with veganism is, up to debate, but let's entertain the possibility that it was about veganism for a moment. The problem is that tweet inspired a ton of online hate, the kind of comments like, why are you, harping on Brian Adams? You guys get triggered over nothing. Chinese people did make COVID through bat soup. They did bring it. They did, there's so much evidence of, I don't know, like Chinese bioweapon labs or whatever nonsense they saw on, their social media that day. The response that we got there was the flood of online hate was like crazy, like we just got so many hateful messages. It was very overwhelming, particularly for, our team who received a lot of like personal hate. I'm not going to go too much into that, but, the kind of effect that has is just like shocking, right? So, and that's just against like one organization who happened to speak out. And so like, it just goes to show like, how pervasive these attitudes are. And particularly, I call these like fringe cases, how fringe cases of racism are so dangerous because they're so controversial. And that kind of thing really like hits it off on social media.
Yeah, it's like the spark, right? The spark that sets it all aflame. And in this instance, it was an individual actor who sent out one tweet, which sent out a cascade of hatred being directed towards a minority group, right? Who they themselves had nothing to do with this. So this is part of the nature of racism. It's not logical. But in addition to individual actors like, say, Donald Trump or Brian Adams, who are sending tweets themselves, we also have hate groups. So organizations, groups specifically bringing people together to promote an agenda. And maybe why don't we talk a little bit about that? How have you seen, especially in Canada, in Canada, the kind of coming together of groups and organizations to attack communities, Asian communities in particular?
So unfortunately, the difficulty with this is a lot of it is done through private messaging platforms, right? And I'll quickly speak to like bringing groups together. Another problem with social media is that it is very polarizing. So it also brings like groups alike. What happens is they show you content and friends or potential friends and people who are posting similar content to you. So this does is it creates this kind of echo chamber where people in this small minority of like radical views, they may start to like sound off each other, and they get connected through social media because it's a connecting platform. It shows you similar people. And so what happens is it's like all of a sudden this small minority gets exposed to all these other people with those similar views, and they're like, oh, I knew I wasn't the only one. I knew that everybody was thinking this. And suddenly it looks like everyone is thinking this because their whole timeline is filled with people like that. For us, I'll be honest, I can't actually tell you what these individual groups are. Like, I don't have an identifiable group that I could just tell you, because a lot of what happens here is it happens behind closed doors. It happens on like WhatsApp group messages. And, I spoke to a representative of WhatsApp, and, we were talking about what can be done to try to, limit the kind of fake news and these echo chambers on social media. And the problem is, like, for example, WhatsApp is like heavily encrypted. WhatsApp themselves cannot actually look into these groups and like see what's happening. And we've tried to do research on like these groups, how they're being recruited, what's going on in these messaging platforms, and due to the sheer scale of online hate, it can't be done by a computer program. It can't be done by an artificial intelligence. It can only be done by having actual people maybe make an account and join one of these WhatsApp groups. But it's like one invisible group among who knows how many. And so the problem is it's so hidden, and it's so like, it just can't be uncovered. Like why, like how they're able to collectively come and flood our inboxes, whatever kind of coordinated movement. And I assume it's coordinated because of the sheer number. I can't tell you what exactly that group is, unfortunately. All I know is that the message seems to get around, and there seems to be some kind of driving force. But I actually suspect that it's social media platforms unintentionally pushing just these kind of radicalized views, people with those kind of radicalized views together, and they're just forming whatever Facebook or WhatsApp groups that they have formed, and they're just spreading this kind of information amongst themselves and like ping-ponging it back against each other until they feel like they're at a breaking point and they have to say something.
And when we're looking at let's call it the public racism and then the private racism and hate, the public, there's millions and millions of people who are being exposed to these kind of ideas, these memes, these ways of thinking. Dr. Adam Rutter, who is he's with the BC Community Alliance. He is a Black professor, and he's focused on dismantling systemic racism. He was saying in one of his anti-racism classes, he had one of his students and an entire course on anti-racism, dismantling the colonized mindset, addressing issues of systemic bias, hatred, racism in society. An entire course, and then the student sees one meme on Instagram that shifts his opinion of an entire community of people. That's the power of the online reality, in fact. Not our world, it's the whole reality. So when we're looking at trying to reduce online hate, to help prevent real world violence, to help take people out of that experience, and even if there's still the smaller groups, but they won't be public, they won't have millions of people to be reached. With your background in law, with your focus on during the COVID-19 pandemic on how the online hate has been fueling so much of this flame, let's maybe talk about a little bit about what the government can do in terms of legislation, because at the end of the day, that is the main piece here that has been missing for so long. So please, Ryan.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think it's interesting that you mentioned memes, because really, like, there is so much power in memes, and people don't always realize that. The bat soup image, with the lady who was, like biting into a bat, and that sparked a huge amount of online hate, right? They were like, this is proof that bat soup was the cause. She's literally eating a bat. But, it was filmed in like Palau or something like that. It was, from a documentary. But at the time, way back in January, February 2020, people just didn't understand what kind of effect that this would have. And honestly, like, neither did we, right? And so, that kind of post, that meme inspired an incredible amount of hate. And really it was possibly like the starting point, or at least the catalyst for this entire anti-Asian, this anti-Asian rhetoric, right? So I'll speak quickly to like the ineffectiveness of current laws. Right now, we don't have real legislation that combats hate speech, in particular online hate. Once upon a time, we had Section 13 of the CHRA, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and that would actually allow people to make applications for the removal of hate, and in particular online hate. But Stephen Harper scrapped it because he was worried that it would infringe people's freedom of speech, even though it had literally been used something like 20 times, like literally 20 times, something like that. And so our current laws only combats and prosecutes hate speech when it has the effect of willful promotion of hatred. And so that is an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly high bar. You need to prove that the person spewing hate wanted to inspire hate, which is, it's so hard because that's a subjective concept, right? You could say that, I was spreading hate to further a political cause. I was spreading hate because I wanted to protect my freedom of speech. I wanted to spread online hate like the bat soup image because it was funny. All of those things could potentially not get caught by the current legislation, by the criminal code. So, something needs to be done about that, right? Like, our current laws are just so ineffective that they're just entirely useless to combat a 21st century problem like online hate. So what needs to be done? Legislative reform. So Section 13 of the CHRA could come back in. That would definitely be a step, so that at least we could prosecute, or at least, remove the most egregious posts. But I think that that's actually not good enough in the current day and age. The power of memes is that it can be spread so far and wide in literally, an hour, 2 hours. Posts get shared, they get screenshotted, they get reposted, they go up on people's stories, and next thing you know, it's been reposted 1 million times within 24 hours. So we need legislative change to change that. I was in a meeting with the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Minister Guilbeault, and my understanding is that they're currently working on draft legislation that they're going to roll out soon. Hopefully taking some of our comments. You mentioned the Antihate network, our organization, our comments and our recommendations. And so I really think that in order for this legislation to be effective, it needs to not work like a traditional tribunal, like the current criminal code. Because what happens is, under the current, under the criminal code, even if it worked, even under Section 13, what would happen is, if I saw a racist post, I could report it, and then there would be an investigation, and then we would, have a trial or a tribunal, and then there would be, you would have to call the other side, and there would be an opportunity to respond, and we could debate about whether it was truly racist, and then after, a long process, maybe it gets removed. But we're talking like a timeline that is just, like the current legal timeline, like trials could be like weeks or months, and that's just a trial. What about the preparation? That could be like months or years. So that's just useless when an online post can be spread 1 million times in an hour, or, within 24 hours. So I really think that there needs to be like a reverse onus. I think that legislation, when it is created, it needs to be done in a way that forces the removal first. And then if you want to contest it, you want to say that it was free speech, it wasn't racist, it was like misunderstood, then you bring this application to have all, go to trial, go to tribunal, whatever, and then we can then argue about whether or not it should be removed. And if you're right, we'll re-upload it, right? If you care so strongly that it was your freedom of speech, you can go fight about it. But for it to be effective, you need removal first. You can't wait months or however long to then remove one post, because by then it would have been spread a million times. So that's my 2 cents on what needs to be done.
And the importance of that, right? The importance of the government taking a stand to really legislate the online world, because it is a world. So today we were having a discussion, and one of our colleagues brought up the idea of digital citizenship. So that in effect, many youth today, they grew up online. They live their lives online. Their friends are online. Perhaps even their jobs are online. Their entertainment is online. It's not a separate kind of temporary place. It is, for many people, their real world. And then the real world is just the place where their bodies exist. So the concept of digital citizenship or responsibility for citizens online, maybe what are your thoughts on that? Like, to help address and create a more welcoming community online, a more beneficial community online.
Yeah, I certainly think that is one of the creative and interesting ideas that we need to solve this 21st century problem. So one of the big problems that we face is like this idea of like fake accounts, trolls, like online anonymity. That, I feel, is actually a huge source of online hate. It's the fact that you can say whatever, you're having a bad day, so you can say something racist anonymously and have no, repercussions, is the problem. It's the reason people feel so free to say these kinds of things. And then that's why it gets spread around and you see it more often. So I certainly think that this is like a very interesting and like one of the solutions that I would definitely love to entertain. And, this idea that like, maybe like your account could get like suspended or removed if you're like spewing like fake news and online hate. Because, like you said, it creates a sense of, citizenship, like a belonging and a responsibility in this online world, that you're not just like a masked figure who can do whatever they want. And, the additional effect of that is that, like I said, like these kind of racist subgroups, they can become echo chambers. But what happens if you like start taking people out of these systems, right? They lose their contacts, they lose their connection to this like shady, underground world with like really offensive views and, quite frankly, wrong views. And so losing that connection, I think, would be huge, to be able to see what other people are actually thinking, to like get out of your bubble and like realize that actually the world doesn't think that it's okay to be racist, that it is Chinese people bringing COVID into the Western world. So I certainly think this is like a very promising solution, and something that I hope that the social media companies would help create.
And part of like our role here as so Islam Unravelled is BC's faith-based community convener. Our job is to bring people together, to form these alliances, to help entertain ideas like this, to help share and speak more with stakeholders, with community members, and with organizations to help find solutions. So as we're kind of nearing the end of our podcast, I want to give you the opportunity maybe to speak to our viewers and give them some advice on maybe how they can be anti-racist and how they can help to have change within their own families and within their own communities, because that's where it all starts.
For sure. So, I just kind of want to go back to one of the themes that I was mentioning in the beginning. I think that everyone and anyone can be a social advocate. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter like, whether or not you've done this kind of work in the past. I think anyone can do it. And I think it's important that everyone does it, because at the end of the day, racism, while it manifests in different ways, it all is rooted in the same thing. It's rooted in white supremacy. And it goes back all the way to like British colonialism, right? It was divide and conquer. Like it's quite simple, really. It was just, you know, the idea that like white people were saving the world, and that it was all these races, or they're pitted against each other and they hate each other for whatever reason. And it's the white saviors who can come in and like, you know, fix up the world, make these structures that like enable civilization and, you know, bring us out of the dark ages. But that's just not true. Like these systems were created to divide us. And while it may seem that all of our experiences are different, they are all deeply interlinked, right? And it's very important that we, you know, one thing is like raise awareness so that, you know, we understand that racism is real and it happens in all community, like racialized, like BIPOC communities. And we need to understand like its roots, and we need to understand what's happening now that, you know, affects, you know, all BIPOC communities. Because again, while it manifests differently, we need to really understand that like our systems need to be changed, and we need people to support all of these changes. Like it can't be, we can't always be arguing, for example, that, you know, freedom of speech, whether or not hate speech is freedom of speech, that kind of thing. You know, the policing issue, you know, like, you know, sometimes there's the perception that it's like, oh, the policing issue is fine because like my community is not policed. For example, the Asian community is not over policed. But you have to understand that, you know, the policing comes from this like racist conception, and the police themselves create a lot of, there's just a huge amount of over policing of certain communities. And while that may not be your community, it is a huge problem, and it creates another divide between your community, for example, the Chinese community, and the Black and Indigenous communities. So I think it's important to understand these concepts. I think it's important to support other communities, even though you may not think that their kind of racism applies to you. It does, because it's all rooted back in white supremacy. And the reason any of us get airtime, the reason any of us listen to each other is because we are not the visible minority. We are the majority, right? You know, and the only way that these issues get pushed, the only way that the government listens to us is if allies, other communities, when we band together and we show that we are in it together, we support each other's causes, we understand and acknowledge each other's difficulties and problems and institutional violence. And that's the only way forward, like, you know, together. And I just hope that everybody, you know, continues to support this kind of work and tries to educate themselves on it.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for this today. We are honored to stand with you and the Asian community in hopefully overcoming these and all other challenges. I know there was so much more we could have gone into today, and maybe in future podcasts we can touch on those topics. But I really wanted to thank you for joining us today, Ryan Chan, Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.